Hello folks, welcome back to the farm. Kind of a drizzly, rainy day outside, so it feels like a soup day. So that's what we're gonna do today. And I kind of alluded to it in one of my previous videos. I'm gonna try to do an old school Portuguese recipe and do it in canning jars so I have it readily available. It's called sopas, or sopa, and that's basically the Portuguese word for soup, basically what it is, but there's a whole bunch of different kinds of Portuguese soup. But this is one that they would traditionally make for like the poor people in town. They'd make it at the church and people would come together and be able to eat. They'd make giant pots of it. Back in the Azores they do it a lot differently. They'll put potatoes and a bunch of other stuff in the soup. But I'm going to make it the way it's made here in the United States. We have Portuguese get-togethers every year all over the state in California. And I used to be a member of one of them, a little town called Hopeton, California, where we would have 2 dinners a year, and then we'd take care of the donators too, because we'd make lots of money for charity, $100,000 probably every year. But it was a big ordeal. I mean, we had 12 big, huge pots, and we'd cook those twice, depending on what was going on that day. But that's the kind of sopa that we're going to make here today, and I'm going to try to put it in a jar. And the reason being is it takes about 12 hours to cook this. But I got to thinking after cooking the beef stew in the canning jars that I could do the same thing with the sopa, because the meat will tenderize as it's cooking in the pressure cooker. And I won't have to wait 12 hours to have a good old Portuguese meal. I can just dump it out of a jar, put it in a pot, warm it up, and put it over bread, and we'll show you how to serve it. But it'll be ready-made, ready to go. And I hope this works out. It's going to be the learning curve, but I think I can figure it out. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to get my broth boiling, which is not normally what you do first. But because of the way we're going to pack this, we want to get the liquids put together so they can absorb the spices and let that simmer for a while, because I'm not going to put the whole spices in the jars. I want to get the flavor in the juice. We'll raw pack the meat in the jars with a little bit of cabbage and a little sprig of mint. And we'll pour the hot juice in, and then we'll can it for 90 minutes in the pressure canner. So let's get the broth going. Okay, my recipe calls for 2 cans of beef broth. The small cans, like 15-ounce cans, they're basically pints. So I'm going to do a quart of our bone broth, which is going to work out good because the meat that I'm going to use is boneless. And normally when you cook this soup, you use the bone-in meat and you get that good bone-in flavor from the bone marrow and all that. So by using the beef broth or the bone broth that we canned up earlier in the year, that's going to add a little bit of that bone flavor. The next thing is 3 cups of water. I've already got 2 cups in there. And then we're going to measure out some wine. Okay, for the wine, you want to just use a cheap red wine. I'm using a hearty Burgundy. You want a red wine that's kind of dryish. Something the old school Portuguese people would drink, or the old school Italians. That's what you're looking for. Some people would even use like a red wine vinegar too. But I prefer the wine. Now the next thing is a cup of tomato sauce. I'm going to use the rest of the tomatoes left over from our bean recipe yesterday. And the bone broth was thicker than just liquid. It was kind of gelatinous. So this is going to add a little more liquid too. So I'm using almost 2 cups of the tomato sauce to make up for that thickness in that. So let's put this in. Next item is a ½ cup of ketchup, and we're using our good homemade ketchup in this recipe. Put that in there. Alright, to that mixture I added one whole chopped white or yellow onion. I used white. And then 3 cloves of garlic, crushed or minced or whatever. I use it out of a jar, so about a teaspoon equals a clove. I put 3 teaspoons in. Next we're going to add our ground spices. So a teaspoon of ground cinnamon. Remember, that's that Portuguese ingredient I told you about yesterday in the bean recipe. Oh, and I apologize for the dishwasher running. 1 tablespoon of salt. I use kosher salt. Now there are whole spices that go into this recipe, and I usually use this little tea ball. It gets 2 bay leaves, and then a half a teaspoon of each of whole cumin seed, whole cloves, whole allspice, and peppercorns. And yes, with the exception of the bay leaves, you could probably throw that in a spice grinder and just throw it into the mix, and that way you wouldn't have to take it out. But this is just the way we've always done it, so I'm going to do it this way this time. Alright, that's all for the liquid mix. Normally the meat would cook right in here, and this is the way we'd cook it. We'd throw the meat in, and we'd simmer it for like 12 hours to get that meat nice and tender. And then like the last hour, we would throw in some cabbage. You just like slice the head of cabbage in half or quartered and throw it in there and cook it for the last hour so it'll soften up. But because we're canning this, we're doing a little bit different. We're going to put that stuff in the jar and pour the liquid over it. I'm hoping we'll get about at least 4 quart jars with this amount of liquid, maybe more. So we'll see. Alright, this mixture has simmered for about an hour, and I think it's simmered quite long enough. I could smell all of the whole spices are infused into the mixture. I've removed the tea ball and I've turned the fire off. And we're going to let this sit for a little bit while we get our jars and our canner ready. And we'll come back and show you the rest of the process. Now when you're pressure canning, it's a good idea before you use your canner, if it's been sitting a while, take the gasket out and flip it over and then reinstall it, because sometimes those gaskets will get a memory with the lid sitting on the pot like that, and if you ever find that it won't start building pressure, that's probably why. So just to be safe and make sure it's going to seal, we flipped it over. So we're going to get this with our water in it and get ready. Our jars are coming out of the dishwasher, and we'll start packing them here in a minute. Okay, we got our jars out of the dishwasher, and we packed our meat in there cold. We used about 3 pounds of chuck roast because it's got good marbling in it. And then on top of the meat, we did about 6 leaves of mint. And I'm going to try to do 7 jars. I know I said we're going to try to do 4, but 7 fit in the canner. So we're going to try to divide up everything to where we get these 7 jars full. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to put cabbage in these jars. Okay, I got the cabbage in the jars. We kind of evenly spaced it out throughout all the jars. And because I only planned on doing 4 jars before, I bought a smaller head of cabbage. So I'm hoping there's enough juice to top up these jars. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure it evenly, like a cup at a time, into each jar. And if I get light, I'm going to add some beef broth to top them up. Alright, I had to top the jars up just a little bit with some beef broth, but that's going to be fine because I think we simmered that sauce down enough to where it concentrated the flavors quite a bit. So I think we're going to be good. If we'd have done 6 jars, I think we'd have been right on the money, redistributing the cabbage and the juice and all that. I think we'd have been spot on. But I've already wiped the tops of the jars. We're going to get lids on these and put the bands on, and we're going to get them in the canner. Remember, you don't have to go crazy with the sterilization with the lids and all that with pressure canning, because this is going to be in there for 90 minutes. So it's going to sterilize everything. So we'll get her done. All right, we got all 7 jars in the canner. We're going to put the lid on, and then we're going to bring this thing, get it to start steaming. We got the fire on high. All right, we got the lid on the canner, and we're purging the air out of it. As soon as this thing continues to steam like constantly, we're going to shut that vent down. We're going to build 11 psi of pressure on the gauge. Because of our altitude, we got to do 11 instead of 10. And then we have our timer set on 90 minutes. So once we reach 11 psi, we'll go for 90 minutes and then we'll shut her off. So normally, pressure cooking something for 90 minutes in the kitchen and having to watch the pressure gauge and throttle the stove up and down to make sure it stays at 11 psi is kind of a chore. But Kelly, being the smarter person of the bunch, said, why don't you just take our indoor ring camera in there and put it by the stove so you can sit in your chair? So that's what we did. So now I can sit here in the comfort of my chair and watch the gauge and just chill in the living room. How smart is she? That's pretty cool. So this is that camera we were talking about. It's only about $50 on Amazon. We used to use it to keep an eye on the house out in California because you always had to worry about people ripping you off. Out here in Nebraska, we just use it to watch the dog when we're not home. Alright, 90 minutes is done at 11 psi. So we're going to let this canner come down to 0 pressure on its own. We're already down to about just below 10 psi, so it's creeping down. And then we'll come back when it's time to take the lid off. Okay, the pressure was all the way down to 0 on the canner, and we double checked it and everything. And we took the lid and cracked it and just left it a little bit ajar. Left the steam come out real slow, waited about 5 minutes, then we pulled the lid off. You can see the material in the jars is still boiling. So we're going to leave the jars inside the canner. What that does, if you remove them right now, you'll get what's called siphoning, and you'll lose some liquid in your jars. So wait about 20-30 minutes. Let those jars kind of cool down in the hot water that's in the canner, and that'll reduce or eliminate the siphoning effect. And we'll bring him back when we got these jars out on the counter and we can take a look at them. Yeah, they sure smell good. Alright, we just got back from a football game. I let them cool off while we were gone. But that's what she looks like. Looks yummy. And we had one that didn't seal. Where'd it go? There it is. So we're going to have to eat that one. Oh darn. So you get you some good rustic bread. You want to make sure it's not that soft stuff that they're making now. I found some of this Italian peasant bread. It's a good, heavy, crusty bread that you want. That soft stuff just disintegrates. You don't want that. So you pour your juice over your bread and you let it soak up. And then you spoon the cabbage and the meat over the top of that. And then you dig in. And it's going to be fantastic. I can already smell it. Now remember folks, you don't have to put this, you don't have to can it. You can just cook it like normal. If you don't want to cook it for 12 hours though, you could put it like in an Instapot or a pressure cooker, and that'll tenderize that meat a lot quicker and you can eat it a lot sooner. Wow, that was phenomenal. I'm going to put the rest of this juice in the fridge because we're going to have that on some more bread tomorrow. Really good. That came out really, really good. Better than I expected. I thought the cabbage would just be completely disintegrated, but it's really not. The best I can describe it is like a deconstructed French dip sandwich. Super good. I didn't care for the bread that I bought though. It's not spot on. It's kind of too dense. But you want a good crusty bread. It can be a little soft on the inside as long as it's not soft on the outside. And if it's too soft, you can cut it up like early in the morning if you're going to have it for dinner, and then let the bread set out all day. Because back in the old days, they used stale bread, basically is what they used, and that's what the juice for, was to kind of rehydrate the bread and make it edible. But super good. We're really going to enjoy this. So try that recipe. It's old school Portuguese Sopas. I'm going to take a jar to my cousin because he said he hasn't had any since they moved back in the 80s. Moved out of California. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy. We love you guys. Bye-bye.